One of Jesus's favorite teaching methods was to use stories. Throughout his ministry, he told many parables, and parables are just short stories that dramatically drill home a point. One of Jesus's most well-known parables, you probably have heard this, is about a father and two sons. And the point of that parable, like many others, was to show what God is like, to paint a picture of God's compassionate heart. If you don't know the parable, here's a summary. The younger son hated dad, couldn't get out of the house fast enough, and demanded his share of the inheritance. And in this culture, it was essentially saying, "Dad, I wish you were dead." And surprisingly, the dad agreed, gave him his inheritance, and as soon as he got his money, he ran away. Catch this is foreshadowing. He ran away from the presence of the father. He ran away from the presence of the father. And for a short time, life was good for him. With all this cash, he lived high on the hog, as they'd say. But then a famine struck, and everything came crashing down around him. He came to his senses, and he came crawling back to dad, hoping against hope that dad would at least hire him. As disgraced as he was, he just wanted to work for his dad, since he knew he'd never be considered a son again. And if you heard the parable before, you already know something amazing that it shows us about God. In the parable, God is depicted as the father. And we read, while the son was still a long way off, his father was looking for him, saw him, felt compassion, and ran and embraced the younger son and kissed him. And this parable powerfully shows what God is like. Looking for those who are far from him, running to those who come, bestowing mercy and grace on those who don't deserve it. Dad threw a party. He celebrated because his son who was dead is alive. And many people love this parable because it shows God's heart. But we often forget what happens next in the parable. Their party is this wonderful scene of celebration, but the parable actually has more to teach us about God. There were two sons. The older brother, he was a good son. He always served dad, never disobeyed, and never got a party like this. Dad never slaughtered even a measly goat for him, let alone the fattened calf, receiving a fine robe, a shiny ring, some kicking new sneakers, and a rocking party. He never got that. So the older brother was angry at dad. He didn't like his father's kindness to his younger brother. And sadly, the parable ends with the older brother standing outside. And we don't know if he ever came in. Again, catch this, foreshadowing. He was miffed at his dad for showing mercy to the undeserving. He was mad that dad showed mercy to the undeserving. And this parable isn't about the sons, it's about God. And this parable ends with the dad speaking. And I think we have it on the board here. He says, "Son, you were always with me, and all that is mine is yours." This is to the older brother. It was fitting to celebrate and be glad for this. Your brother was dead, and he's alive. He was lost and is found. And the point Jesus was highlighting was God's compassion, his love and mercy, an invitation to both brothers, younger and older. Both are welcomed into a loving relationship with dad. And when we step back and analyze this parable more, there's something that kind of pokes us about it. One way to understand the point of a parable is to find out the setting. Why would Jesus tell this parable? This one in Luke 15 was told to the Pharisees. It was told to the religious leaders. It's the last of three rapid-fire parables with a similar point, and this one has the most punch to it. It hits the hardest. You see, the Pharisees were mad, just like the older brother, mad because Jesus was eating with tax collectors and sinners. He associated with them. He even welcomed them. Oh, the humanity of him doing that, right? One translation lays out their accusation. Jesus takes in sinners and eats meals with them, and this is what bothered them. He treats them like old friends. To us, this doesn't seem like a bad thing. Like, sounds good, right? But to the Pharisees, it was awful because these sinners were dirty. These sinners were undeserving. And this helps us understand the parable, how it displays God's heart to explain why Jesus was doing this. God shows kindness and love to those who are undeserving. And it should have really stung because the ending of the parable compared God's heart to their hearts. That's really the punch of the parable of the prodigal son. Jesus contrasting the response of the father and the older brother. Do you see the difference? The dad celebrated, the older brother pouted. And this exposed the Pharisees. They didn't like God showing mercy to people they deemed undeserving. And that's also the beauty of the parable. It shows us that the younger brother isn't deserving of the father's mercy, and neither is the older brother, right? Neither is the older brother. Isn't that a beautiful display of God's heart? God welcomes everyone. You see, Jesus was showing them why he welcomes sinners, because he has the Father's heart. He has the Father's heart. And at the same time, Jesus was urging us, everyone who follows him, to have the Father's heart towards others, to rejoice when anyone comes closer to God. Commentator Darrell Bock sums it up by saying, Jesus wants a community filled with people who can forgive and restore those who turn to God. And this is key. He continues by saying, don't be an older brother. God is displeased with any who are disgruntled and sit sulking on the outside. And this should cause us to reflect on God's welcome of us. Reflect on God's mercy shown to you. And then consider how we are or are not welcoming to others. Are we welcoming the people the same way God does? Do our lives resemble Jesus? He takes in all people, and how does he eat with them? He treats them like old friends, right? Could we say the same about ourselves? Now, if you're checking your vision because you see a whale on the screen, and you've looked in your bulletin and it says Jonah, and you hear me talking about Jesus' parable, let me assure you, your vision is fine. This is a sermon about Jonah. As tough as it might be to believe, I'm introducing Jonah. This is crazy to see. Hold on to your hats. Jonah is like both brothers. None of you are shocked. Let me explain. He's like both brothers. He's like the younger brother who ran away from his father and came crawling back. And he's like the older brother who sat outside the party pouting because dad showed mercy to someone he didn't think was deserving. Think of it, a real life person who seems to embody both sons in Jesus' parable. So why am I starting this way? Because I think Jesus' parable gives us the right framework to understand Jonah. It helps us to understand the main question for today, which is, what's the point of Jonah? What's the point of Jonah? Why is it part of our Bible? What can it teach us? While we're at it, who wrote Jonah anyway? That's what I want to answer. But before we get there, let's get something out of the way. We're going to find out that the children's version of Jonah, many of us are familiar with, it really isn't all that helpful, and it'd be better if you just forgot it. I know, sounds harsh. That's not how I mean it. I don't mean it harsh. I just think a clean slate is best. What do I mean? What's the children's version of Jonah? Jonah ran away from God, got on a boat, and because he's a bad prophet, God sent a storm, right? Sailors were fearful of the storm, and they tossed him overboard. God sent a whale to swallow him and teach Jonah a lesson. And when Jonah finally saw his error, he asked for forgiveness. The whale spit him up on shore, and now that he's a changed man, Jonah obeyed God and had great success. The end, right? If that's what you think when we start talking about Jonah, I don't want to take the wind out of your sails, pardon the pun, but it'd be better if you just forgot and started with a clean slate. Wash it away. Here's why. When it's packaged like that, it really misses the point of Jonah. It focuses us on Jonah or the whale or the sailors and not on God. And so one more thing before we go further. Here's 60 seconds of background just to get us up to speed on Jonah. Jonah is buried in the part of the Old Testament with many other prophets. It's really hard to find. If you're looking for it, it's on page 451 in the Blue Pew Bibles. In fact, it's probably one of the more difficult books to find because the books around it are so short, and it's all these different names. And Jonah's only 4 chapters. Now, Jonah is like other prophets in that God spoke to him directly and had a message he wanted Jonah to communicate. But at the same time, Jonah's unlike all the other prophets. He is the only prophet who was sent to proclaim God's message to a different nation. This is interesting. All the other prophets were sent to Israel. Jonah was sent to a different nation. Jonah, he was told to go tell the Ninevites God's message. And this is out of the ordinary. He's the only one. And add to it, the Ninevites, they weren't winning any awards for being great, upstanding people. In fact, they were some of the worst at the time. This is what God said to Jonah. Arise, go to Nineveh, that great city, and call out against it, for their evil is so bad that it's come up before me. Their evil is so bad it's come up before me. Here was Jonah's assignment. Go outside Israel and proclaim God's message of judgment to wicked foreigners. And now we're going to talk more in the coming weeks about specifics, how he responded, what God did, and all that. But this should give you a good starting point to at least understand the main contours of Jonah. Okay, here's my question. What's the main point of Jonah? What's the main point of the book? It's likely you're already thinking along the right lines because of how we started. What's the main point of the parable of the prodigal son? To show the heart of God the Father who welcomes the undeserving. It has this dual effect of welcoming both those who've made a mess of their lives, the younger brothers, and kind of giving a brushback to the self-righteous, to the older brothers. It shouldn't surprise us then to find that the main point of Jonah, a prophet who kind of embodies both brothers, is similar. Jonah is not about this bad prophet. It's not about a whale or a storm or even the Ninevites. Jonah is all about God. Jonah teaches us something profound about God, that God has boundless compassion for all people, that he has boundless compassion for all people. If we use the terms Israel would have used, God loves us, right? The insiders, and God loves them. God loves the outsider, the other, people who aren't like us, people who aren't near us. God loves people who don't think like we do or act like we do. That's the point of Jonah, God's boundless compassion. The ESV study Bibles, they have the great introductions to each book of the Bible. In the introduction to Jonah, we read this: the primary purpose of the book of Jonah is to engage readers in theological reflection on the compassionate character of God, and in self-reflection on the degree to which their own character reflects the compassion, to the end so that we become vehicles of this compassion in the world God has made and so deeply cares about. What does that mean? It's telling us Jonah shows us God's compassion and then challenges us to be compassionate like God. Also to become God's hands and feet in the world around us. That's the purpose of Jonah. Now here's the other thing that's really cool. Jonah ends the same way Jesus' parable ends, with the Father speaking. Jonah ends with God expressing his compassion. He said to Jonah, "Should I not pity Nineveh? Should I not pity Nineveh?" God is telling Jonah why he did all that he did. Just like Jesus told the Pharisees why he welcomed sinners, God told Jonah why he sent him to Nineveh, what his purpose was. And it was his compassion. He pitied people who were far from him. And God doesn't just have this compassionate, warm, fuzzy heart feeling. It's more. God did something. That's the other part of Jonah. God did something. Because he loves people who are far from him, he took this prophet from Israel and said, go and tell these people about me, right? Go to them. And this challenges us to ask, do we have hearts like God's towards those who don't know him? Do we imitate and reflect this compassionate God we serve? This all seems easy to grab hold of when I say it like that. And now I'm going to kind of warn you here. The reality is, if you go home and read Jonah sometime this week, after the extra 3 to 5 minutes to find it, you're going to start reading it and think, how in the world did Eric get that out of this? Because honestly, Jonah's challenging to read. I'm just shooting straight with you. It isn't as straightforward as we want it to be. It's far from straightforward. It's a confusing book, partially because a lot of details aren't included. Details that seem that they'd be really helpful. Maybe more confusing is Jonah. When you read, you can't really tell, is he a good guy or is he a bad guy? Are his actions good or bad? We wonder, should we be like Jonah? Or should we be as much unlike Jonah as possible, right? We really don't know. He's a confusing hot mess. It's hard to understand his motivations or what makes him tick. At times, he seems like this little brat running away from home. Then he seems to take responsibility and sacrifice himself for others. And then right smack in the middle of that is this prayer in the belly of the fish. Like, what is that? Is that his come to Jesus moment? Because if it is, he's still got a long ways to go, right? Because after that, he acts like a petulant child pouting on the hillside. The ESV study Bible says Jonah's a laughable figure. Like, we can't take him seriously, yet he's got a book of the Bible named after him. He's a prophet of God that God chose, right? So isn't that a good thing? Now, overall, Jonah reads a lot like a fishtail. Gary and I are going to compete over puns, right? Now, I'm not talking a fishtail like swish swish. A fishtail, like, boy, is my fish big, right? Pardon the pun again. There are a few ways this comes across stylistically. The first is, everything in the book seems larger than life. Like this giant fish you caught that nobody believes, right? It strains believability. And I say that as someone who believes in miracles, like many of you do. I believe God created this world, can intervene however he sees fit. That means things that strain believability really aren't a problem for me. But Jonah, it seems different. It doesn't read like Jesus' miracles, nor does it read like a nation crossing the Red Sea or winning battles when they're outnumbered 100 to 1. I mean, think about it. Jonah's task was to preach to an entire city, huge city. Just one man. We can't really imagine such a task. Same with the fish that swallows him. Like, is that even possible? And then when he's in the fish, like, what is he doing? Is he alive? Is he dead? Is he doing a Sudoku puzzle? We don't know what he's doing. And then when he finally obeys God, he gave an 8-word sermon, and they respond positively. Like, everyone repented, and his sermon was just 8 words, and you're thinking, Eric, are you taking notes? 8-word sermons, that's what we want. Yeah, see? Add to this deep irony and humor that's splashed across the page. Again, pardon the pun. Is Jonah a good guy or a bad guy? I mean, he makes some really dumb choices. He acts like a kid, and yet he's a prophet, ironically, right? We expect prophets to be better. Jonah is not. And don't you find it a bit ironic and actually humorous that Jonah, a prophet of God, attempted to run away from God? Like, Jonah, figure it out. He's God, right? You're not going to run away from him. It's hilarious that he even tried. And finally, there's this irony between Jonah preaching to these people he really doesn't want to see saved. In chapter 3, God relented of the disaster he promised. And we think, hooray, people won't be destroyed, right? Not Jonah. He's not even indifferent to it. Chapter 4 starts with this. It displeased Jonah exceedingly, and he was angry. It's ironic that God's messenger, God who clearly loves these people, had compassion on them, that's why he sent Jonah. God's messenger has no such compassion. It's a sad commentary on Jonah that this made him angry. Big time older brother vibes, right? Here's the thing about Jonah, why it's hard for us to take it all in and comprehend it. We like simple stories. We don't really like complex ones. We like fables, short, to the point, clear who the good guy is, clear who the bad guy is. We can see consequences for bad behavior, reward for good. We love TV sitcoms that wrap up in 30 minutes with a happy ending, right? We like movies where 15 minutes in, we know who the bad guy is. We probably even know where the story's going. And then in the end, the bad guy gets his comeuppance. We like that. That's how we want our world to work. Good is rewarded, bad is punished, clean, simple, straightforward. You will not find that in Jonah. You will not find that in Jonah. And honestly, that's not what we find in real life, is it? It's not real life. None of the characters in Jonah are all good or all bad. In fact, when you read deeply, it's the pagan sailors and the heathen Ninevites that act with more virtue than Jonah does. Prophet of God. The people are real. And then with surprising twists we don't anticipate. God doesn't act the ways we want him to. God doesn't do what we think he should do in the book. Tim Keller relays the story of someone who didn't have much of a religious upbringing, marveling at Jonah when she studied it because it wasn't what she expected, a Bible story. She said, I thought the God of the Bible was just a figure of melodrama, smiting pagans, blessing believers. But she says, the God of Jonah is not like that at all. He's complex, extremely complex. Sometimes he blesses believers and judges the pagans, but at other times he blesses pagans and punishes believers. What's she highlighting? That God is not just a God of wrath, and he's not just a God of love, he's both. Not just wrath, not just love, he's both. And she added, in unpredictable ways. Look at Jonah. When he ran away from God, God sent a storm, an act of judgment. But then, just as quickly, God sent a fish, an act of mercy. Turn around, and Jonah's message to Nineveh was a message of judgment. But because they responded, God showed mercy. Turn around again, and Jonah's off pouting on the hillside, mad at God for showing mercy. Again, ironically, because Jonah rejoiced at God's mercy to him. Remember this elegant psalm of thanksgiving in chapter 2. And then when Jonah did that, God didn't send another storm for Jonah's wrong heart. He didn't blast him with lightning. Not this time. This time God sends a shade tree. Then he follows that with an annoying desert wind. It all winds up ending with this. God speaking. Should I not pity Nineveh? God showing mercy to Jonah and Nineveh, neither of which are deserving. What we find shining through at the end of Jonah is God's mercy. Mercy to those who don't deserve it. And because of the nature of mercy, it shows up in unexpected ways. It shows up at unexpected times. It's unpredictable. Listen, you can't set your watch to it. You can't schedule God's mercy, and we both love that, And we kind of hate that, don't we? We love that God's mercy can be unpredictable to us. Oh, the mercy of God, I love it. Like Jonah, we're relieved when the giant fish rescues us from the jaws of death. But we also can be cranky and pouty when God's mercy is shown to those we don't think deserve it. We're a little miffed like Jonah when people don't get what's coming for them. At least what we think is coming for them. And what do we wonder? Where is justice? Why is it delayed? Maybe what I'm getting at is this. We can be a lot like Jonah. We can be a lot like the younger brother and the older brother. And acknowledging this about ourselves can be good. It's good because it helps realign us and realize we aren't so great and wonderful and perfect. It's good because it reminds us that we need God. And really, that's where our focus should be, God, not ourselves. And this helps us become more thankful for what God's like. And when we boil it all down, that's the most important thing about Jonah. Jonah teaches us about the Father's heart. It teaches us the same thing the parable of the prodigal son teaches. God is compassionate and welcoming. We may not know where or how God's mercy will show up, but because of who God is, we know he will show mercy. He will show mercy to the undeserving, compassion to those who don't deserve it. God loves people who are far from him. God loves people who are near him. God even loves people who claim to follow him and still run away from him, right? God the Father loves and shows mercy to the younger and older brothers. And we'll finish with this because this is amazing. There's one thing the mercy of God will do if it gets deep in your bones. It is something God's mercy will produce in us as we experience it. It's the same thing that happened to Jonah, though it's not officially recorded in the Bible, but it's there if we look. Think about this. Who wrote the book of Jonah? Who wrote Jonah? Only someone who knows private details, right? In fact, most of the book would be completely unknown if not for Jonah spilling the beans. Even if Jonah didn't write the book, he shared details with the person who did. And Tim Keller asked the perfect question. What kind of man will let the world see what a fool he was? This is an embarrassing story. So what kind of man would let the world see what a fool he was? Who would let us know these frankly humiliating details? Most of this stuff, you and I, we'd keep to ourselves. It would wound our pride too much to share it, let alone record it. What kind of man would do that? Only someone who'd become joyfully secure in God's love. Only someone who believed that he was simultaneously sinful and completely accepted. It's this full circle moment. Jonah was the younger brother, then the older brother, and then the younger brother again. And at some point it stuck. At some point the penny dropped. He got it. God's mercy wasn't just a concept. It wasn't this academic paper he read about. He came to know what a mess he was. How badly he messed up and failed. And then like a wave, the mercy of God came crashing over him. It must have blown him away. Wait a minute, he thought. I'm just as bad as the Ninevites. I'm just as wicked. I deserve destruction. But I'm not destroyed. I'm not obliterated. I didn't drown. I'm not abandoned. God is still speaking to me. Wow. Right? God loves me. And it must have transformed him to become a man who would share these details. God pitied Nineveh, and God pitied Jonah. And God has compassion on us. And he realized it wasn't something God owed him because Jonah's so great. It wasn't something God did because that's God's job. He just forgives. It was personal for Jonah. God accepted Jonah just as he was. And that same wave can crash over you. The wave of God's compassion, his love, the forgiveness he offers. Actually, I hope and pray it does. This is the God we're going to study the next few weeks. May God show us that we are simultaneously sinful and completely accepted. And may we be changed to be so humble and forthright with our mistakes with one another. Oh, what a perfect way to start, because we've got communion. If the servers would come forward to serve communion, we're going to celebrate communion. And when you think about it, communion is this powerful symbol. As they hand those out, there is bread and juice. If you take one of each and then pass it down your row, that would be awesome. Let me explain just briefly what communion is all about. It teaches us, one, that we are simultaneously sinful, which means that we have messed up. We have made mistakes. We have run from God. Even if you haven't physically run from God, there's areas of your life that you have kept off limits to God. There's areas of your life where he has told you to do A and you have done Z. There's areas of your life there where you have said, I'm not going to do this. I don't want to do this my way instead of God's way. And in communion, we find the cup represents Jesus' forgiveness. On the night where he was betrayed, he took the cup and he said, this is the new covenant in my blood, which means that his blood was shed for your mistakes, for your sin. And that's how we can be simultaneously sinful and completely accepted. Because what does he say in the bread? This is my body given for you. The perfection of Jesus was lived out on this life, on earth. And for 33 years, he perfectly obeyed God. Where we messed up, he perfectly obeyed. And his body was broken for us. And all of it is this wonderful reminder that God looks at us and he pities us. He has compassion on us, just like he had compassion on the younger brother in the parable, compassion on the older brother, compassion on the sailors, compassion on the Ninevites, compassion on Jonah. He has compassion on us. And when we celebrate communion, we take both the bread and the cup and we say, I'm simultaneously sinful and completely accepted.